The Apostle Paul said, I am the chief of sinners. What in the world does that mean? Let's dive right in. 1 Timothy chapter 1. The Apostle Paul, as he writes to a young man that was his child in the faith, someone he was really trying to be an example for, he said to him, Timothy, I am the chief, the foremost of all sinners. And there's a 4-verse section in this first chapter where he really chronicles the sin that's in his life and some things I don't think he ever really got over. And he says in verse 13 that I was a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent aggressor. And I don't know that he ever got past seeing himself through this lens of really shame for what he had done and even some guilt. It kind of flies in the face of the self-forgiveness movement that's in our world today.
In fact, I just want to tell the audience here, I want to say about a month ago, I was doing a class on self-forgiveness, and I pointed out that in Scripture, there's just no basis for self-forgiveness. And then you were in the class and raised your hand, and you made this incredible point, and you said, I don't think Paul ever forgave himself. Yeah. I just don't think that's part of his process of healing. And in fact, this passage, in my opinion, shows perfectly the alternative to self-forgiveness, which is instead give it to God.
Wow. That is such an enormous thought. You're really telling us that the biblical pattern of forgiveness is get over yourself and realize that it's not about you anyway, and that the only true forgiveness that comes from God. And when you have that, self-forgiveness becomes unimportant.
Yeah, it's irrelevant.
Because really, you're taking everything and giving it to God. And we make the mistake of trying to deal with it ourselves and forgive ourselves and feel better about ourselves. And God said, if you want to feel good about you, let me live in you.
Well, and think about it. If Paul had forgiven himself, that he would have left nothing for God to forgive.
Isn't that true? And he did see himself for what he really was. And he goes down a list and he says, I was a blasphemer. In other words, I was living in violation to not only the way God wanted me to live, but it wasn't moral issues here. He was blaspheming because he had not properly interpreted and handled the word. If he had properly understood and interpreted the Old Testament, guess what? He would have accepted Jesus when he showed up.
Yeah, and Jesus actually says that to the Pharisees in John chapter 5, and I think it's like this, the last 2 verses of that chapter. He says, if you believed in Moses, then you would believe in me. Yeah. And he's basically saying, guys, I don't think you believe this.
Yeah.
Because if you believe this, you would believe Jesus Christ.
And you can carry that then back to Stephen's sermon in Acts 7. He gives this great defense, and in the midst of that sermon, he's quoting all the prophets and pointing out that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's the fulfillment of prophecy. This has been planned by God from the beginning. And it says that Saul is standing there listening to that sermon that day. And when they get ready to kill Stephen, because of the great invitation he offers, which I'll give you in just a second, it says that Saul stood by holding the garments and he says, I was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. He thought Stephen was blaspheming by the way he was interpreting those passages. And instead, Stephen was telling the truth. And Paul was the blasphemer because he was rejecting the proper application of the word of God. And therein is the definition of blasphemy. So Stephen gets to the end of his sermon and he says, and I wonder how this will go over in most pulpits, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised of heart and ears, just like your fathers did before you, even do ye now, resisting the Holy Spirit. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And look what you've done now. You've put to death the Lord of glory. Prophets, Old Testament, the evidences of the Bible, you've neglected all of them. And that's what made, in large part, him feel like the chief of sinners. He had not listened to God, and because of that, he got himself in a position where he was fighting against God. That's what Jesus said on the road to Damascus. Why are you fighting against me?
We say that's the beautiful thing about Paul's statement right here, and this is probably one of the most encouraging statements in the New Testament to just people who struggle and have a bad past. But he says that he was a blasphemer. And then he says, and because I acted ignorantly in unbelief. Now, that's not what you would expect someone who was a full devout Jew to say.
Yes.
Because he was admitting that even in his walk in Judaism, he was walking in unbelief.
Yeah, wow.
I mean, very honest, very transparent about his past.
And look where his past took him. That misunderstanding of all of that, again, turned him and made him a warrior against God. Acts 8:4 says, right after he was part of the mob that killed Stephen, that he ravaged the church. He would say himself later in chapter 22, verse 19, that he was a violent aggressor, that he imprisoned and beat and had put to death all the Christians he could round up and bring back. So his blasphemy, his rebellion, his unwillingness to submit to Christ and to see who he was, created a monster. And he said, and he doesn't get over that. He struggles to let go of that. I would suggest that in our world today, there are a lot of people who feel like they're too bad to be saved.
Yeah.
This is evidence that you can't be too bad.
Yeah. You know what's worse than killing a person? Killing a child of God. And I think when Jesus appears to Paul, he says, Saul, Saul, why dost thou persecute me?
Yeah.
What was Paul doing? He was going after the people who believed in Jesus Christ. The greatest of all sins is the persecution of the Lord's church. Why? Because how you treat a follower of Christ is directly how you're treating Jesus Christ in that moment. And Paul realized that once he realized who the Lord of creation really was in Jesus Christ. And that's one reason why he's so hard on himself, because this is not this is not a sin to be taken lightly. This is a sin that deserves punishment. And yet, when you go to verse 12, Jesus Christ, who has strengthened me because he considered me faithful, putting me into service. What? Man. Wow.
Yeah, there are a lot of wows in that verse 12. He's saying, and notice, he strengthened me.
Yeah.
He considered me faithful. He put me into service. You can just sense the total reliance on God, on Christ for his salvation. And I think that's one of the reasons that God let the evil intent in Saul's heart flesh out to its fullness. He could have converted Saul of Tarsus right after the death of Stephen. Why didn't Jesus just appear to him right then and convert him? He could have saved the lives of all of those Christian people. Why did God wait? I think the answer is that by this evil coming full blown, it let Saul reach a point where there really was, in his mind, no way for him to ever be saved other than for Jesus Christ to just speak his salvation.
Come in. Yeah. I really think you're right. I don't think you could take the best Christian and best Bible student who was a Christian at the time and present Paul a Bible study. I don't think he would have received it. I really think it would have taken Jesus Christ to come himself, exactly what happened on the road to Damascus.
I think you're right. And then you ask the question, because you go to 1 Corinthians 2, that's where it makes me jump. That passage, beginning verse 10 down to verse 16, speaks of how God communicates with man. And it starts out with revelation. God gives a revelation. Then that has to, through inspiration, be recorded so that it can be communicated. Because just because I might have, as an apostle, had a direct revelation, that doesn't necessarily mean I can properly communicate it to you. So inspiration is involved. But then after that is illumination. He says the natural man can accept the things of the Spirit of God. I hear Paul talking about himself in that word. He says he can't even understand them because they're spiritually appraised. And so we struggle to get close enough to God, and God has to interact and intervene in our lives. But I still think it's in a willing heart. There was one thing that Saul never lacked, I believe, and that is, when he really came to understand truth and know it, there was nothing that was going to stand in his way, and he would surrender everything. I think that was probably true even as he was a Pharisee.
Yeah, he's one of those guys who's all in or he's all out. There's no in between for him.
Absolutely. All in or all out. And when the all in came, he realized that he was all in because of what had been done for him. He strengthened me. He called me faithful. He led me into service. And so now he comes full flesh, full circle into this service. And in verse 14, it says, the grace of the Lord was more than abundant. I said a minute ago, no one can be too bad to be saved. Paul's evidence of that. But if you look here, this word abound, Paul uses that word 106 times. And almost always it's used to describe the measure of grace and the measure of mercy extended by God. And I don't think Paul ever, not only could he probably never get over his own wickedness and what he had done, the evil, but I don't think Paul ever, I think till the day he died, he was amazed at the grace of God.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to the self-forgiveness thing. He wasn't interested in forgiving himself because he was so overwhelmed that God forgave him. That the blood of Christ could cover everything he did. That overwhelmed him to the point where that's all he needed. And it empowered him for service in the kingdom of God.
All right. 2 Corinthians 9:8, he wrote, God is able to make all grace abound, there's that word again, abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound, uses it again, in every good work.
Yeah.
And so he's telling Corinth, you've been given tremendous blessings, put them to work.
Yeah.
One of the things that we need to be conscious of is that turning everything to God doesn't just involve the blessings that are in your life. People say, well, Lord, you can have everything I possess, my money, my car, my house, use it all for your glory. But we aren't really good at doing what Saul did, which is where the proof really exists. He took the bad things in his life and put them to use in the kingdom.
Yeah, boy. And when you start looking on that level of things, I mean, that takes you to a whole different place, and it gives you a focus and determination, and it gives you a passionate relationship, because God signed off on a pardon of a tremendous debt that he had. And not only did he pardon it, he put him to work. And so you've been freed so that you can now take service in God's kingdom. How many of us are just taking the note that says you're free, but we're not finding our service in his kingdom?
Yeah. Maybe if I'm right and God did let all of that kind of evil in Saul's heart fester before he converted him, before he reached him, is it possible that we have people who are watching this podcast today who are looking at their lives and they're wondering about all that's there, and oh my goodness, is it possible that God let it come to that point in their lives as well, so that they now have this moment where they can take all of that and lay it on the altar and use it to reach other souls?
Yeah. Otherwise, they're disabusing grace. Why did he extend such favor to you? So that you can get to work in his kingdom.
Yeah. People are prone to see their salvation only in proportion to their perceived sin.
Yeah.
I say that because another aspect of not understanding the grace of God, the opposite of people who constantly looking for self-forgiveness and constantly feeling as though they're not good enough for the kingdom, there are those who feel too good. People who don't really feel like they even need the blood of Christ. You said something a second ago that called us back to the Garden of Eden, and it was talking about sin and how when sin enters the world, what does that environment look like? That they weren't doing horrendous things.
No.
And I think there are a lot of Christians who kind of have this comfort zone. They're not really convicted. They've never had a Pauline experience of conversion because they never felt like they really did anything that bad. And I think that affects their life.
I think a lot of that is associated with people who are maybe second or third generation Christians, whose their father or mother were the ones who really got out of a tough spot. And you often hear them say, well, I've never killed anybody. I've never, done all these things. But when you go back to Adam and Eve, what was their sin? Out of rebellion, they ate fruit.
Yes.
Well, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but guess what? It too also demanded the blood of Christ.
Yeah. Boy, it's so hard to get past that. You were saying something earlier about the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, before the show was that Jesus does a beautiful job of showing where people are before God. Because, for example, the passage on murder, he says, you say murder is this, but if you've just hated a person in your heart, you've committed murder. Right. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, well, I have hated somebody before. Or adultery, right? People say, well, I've never committed adultery. I've never cheated on my wife. I've never snuck out or any of those things. But then Jesus says, yeah, but if you've lusted after a woman, you've committed adultery. Yeah. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, okay.
Maybe I've been there.
Yeah. And what he did is he was, with that one sermon, it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to feel uncomfortable at some point of what he says, because he makes it very spiritual to the heart, not just on the behaviors outwardly. Yeah. And he says, some of us are great sinners in here, and others are great sinners out here, but we both partook of it.
And it's all equal. And therein is a problem of conviction. We tend to see our need for Christ in direct relationship to our perceived level of sin. Yeah. If I haven't sinned very much, I don't feel like I need very much grace, and so I don't need God as much. And that gets into that problems of self-reliance rather than true conviction. And it also makes it harder to give everything back to God, because you don't really feel like he gave you that much to start with. And it is a misunderstanding of sin. Yep. All sin is equal, and even one sin is enough to drive us away. And I would go so far as to say this: even if Adam and Eve had committed the only sin ever committed, and it was nothing but eating that piece of fruit. It would have required the death of Jesus with all the ugliness and every welt and every bruise and every nail to have saved them in that one sin, the same amount, just as it takes that amount of sacrifice to save the vilest of sinners. It's all the same.
Well, and the thing is, the greatest offense to sin is towards God. And it doesn't matter if you made small sins and big sins. Every sin separates you from the relationship with God. And because of that, Jesus Christ had to come and die just the way he did, as you described, for everyone. And I think it's so hard for people who've been raised in a church who, because their family before them decided to make the right decision, put on Christ in baptism, who brought them up better and more informed on the ways of righteousness. The fact that they haven't done certain things that their dad before them did, that is the work of God. That is a blessing of God, only by grace. But don't think that you're not a sinner. You're just a sinner, just like the old man before you.
Boy,
But you have to be honest about sin and what it means and what you've partaken of. And I think even though you may not relate, just like I don't fully relate to what Paul calls himself out, Paul does show an attitude here. You need to be very blunt and truthful about who you were and what you've done. And then give that to God.
That's right. And that means whether it is a really bad sin, the way the world counts sin, or whether we're talking about something that in your mind may seem lesser. The reality is all sin is sin, and all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, says Paul in Romans 3:23. So our goal is to continue to stretch and to reach and to understand where we all are before God. There are no rungs on a ladder drawing us closer to him because of anything we've done or anything we haven't done. We're all flat-footed on the earth, needing the entire grace and mercy of Jesus in order to be saved. So take whatever's in your life, good or bad, give it to God. And if you're the chief of sinners in your generation, use it for his glory. And if you've been blessed beyond measure, well, use that too. We'll see you next time.